Pole would become the South Pole and the opposite. Then about 8 or 9 months ago, these same scientists went back on the internet and made an even stronger warning. They said that the anomalies had become so great that they were expecting the possibility of a magnetic pole shift any minute. What science knows as fact is that about 13,000 years ago, there was a physical pole shift. The pole shift coincided with the other end of where we are right now in the precession of the equinoxes, which would be about 13,000 years ago, exactly on the opposite end of this cycle from where we are right now. They believe that Hudson Bay was the site of the North Pole before this axis shifted. Then a little less than 26,000 years ago, at exactly the very point we happen to be within at this moment in the precession of the equinoxes, the end of time, where we are right now, close to December 21st, 2012, the Earth's physical poles shifted a second time. And if that is not shocking enough, what science knows is that when the Earth's physical axis shifts to a new location, it only takes 20 hours, less than 1 day. This is not the Mayans saying this. This is the scientific world has documented this. You wake up one morning, and in a single day, your world is completely transformed. But back to the magnetic poles. What science has also noticed is that directly before the Earth's physical pole shift, there is always a magnetic pole shift, followed by a period of no magnetic fields. It is shut down completely. What is now only a theory, because of modern man has never been alive modern man anyway, has never witnessed this kind of thing. But this theory is the only theory that comes to really explain how this is possible. If you think about it, the Earth is massive, and that to change the axis of the Earth would require a huge amount of energy. And that's almost impossible. Scientists have never been able to figure this out, of how this is possible. The amount of energy would be just, it would be like the moon hitting the Earth, something of this kind of level. And then, so how can the Earth possibly move its axis somewhere? The amount of energy that would take is just stupendous. It would be as though a moon had hit the Earth, or something of that nature would take place. But it doesn't. The Earth has shifted its axis hundreds and hundreds of times over the last few 100 million years. And so science could never figure this out. They didn't know how this was possible. And then a theory came up recently, not very long ago, 20, 30 years ago, I believe. And the theory was this. There is a crust on the Earth. It's only 20, 30, 40 miles thick. It's not very thick. And underneath that is called the mantle. And there is an upper mantle, which is that connects the crust to the inner part of the Earth. And this upper mantle is made out of rock. However, what the scientists have discovered is that if the magnetic field of the Earth goes to zero, disappears completely, which is what they expect to happen very soon, then after about 2 weeks, this rock formation that is all around the Earth turns to a liquid. It's like oil. And so now the outer crust of the Earth is completely free to spin in any direction it wants. And so it would still take a great amount of energy to move that, but nothing like it would require to move the entire Earth to a new axis. And so, how do I say this? What they believe is going to happen is you now go to the South Pole, and the ice on the South Pole is not perfectly centered. It's off-center. It's a massive amount of ice, miles, about 2.5 miles high or so. It's a huge amount of ice. In fact, if that ice were to melt, it would raise the oceans, the entire world's oceans, I believe, close to 200 feet. It's a lot of water. And so that mass, when when the surface of the earth, the crust of the earth, is now free to rotate, it's off center, and they believe it will move toward the center of balance, and when it does, the crust moves with it. So the world scientists have now calculated where they believe, they have predicted where they believe the axis of the earth is going to go, which is almost identical to Edgar Cayce. Interesting enough. Edgar Cayce says it'll be 16 degrees into Russia in this particular place, and the mathematical scientists have calculated about 17 degrees into Russia, into almost exactly the same place. And so if it's true, we don't know, but this is a theory. Nobody has ever seen this happen. At least no modern man has. Now, the shifting of the poles of the axis, however it is to take place, it is this world that the Maya wish to speak to you about, for they know it well. They remember their past, and they remember both of these pole shifts that science has recorded in recent times. According to the Maya, they lived through both of them, and they have been on Earth for at least 26,000 years. Science cannot contradict that because they don't know where they came from and they don't know anything about them. But according to Don Alejandro, in the last pole shift, millions of people died simply because they didn't understand what was happening. If they only knew and understood the situation, they could have easily transformed their experience into something of strength and grace and beauty. But Don Alejandro says that if they don't understand what is occurring and enter into fear, they can easily die. And so he wants to talk to you about this. Don Alejandro also speaks about 30 hours of darkness that happens at this moment when the poles shift. There are some people out there, I'm aware, that speak about 3 days of darkness. The Mayans say no, it's not 3 days, it's 30 hours. He says that, Don Alejandro says, that everything goes black and one cannot even see the stars at night. Or in other words, we go blind. He says it is during this period that so many people died because of fear that entered into their experience. But he also says that if one were to not worry and simply stay still and just relax, everything returns back, your sight comes back, everything returns to normal, and it only takes 30 hours. So this is another thing that the Mayan people want you to understand is during this change, don't go into fear. It's nothing to be afraid of. But of course, after the poles shift, where you are located on the surface of the earth is now probably completely different relative to the equator than before the shift began. You are now probably living in a new and different environment located on the earth. And this must immediately be evaluated. You've got to figure out where you are, or you could die just from extreme cold or extreme heat. This is another thing he wanted you to know. Now, one piece of the Mayan prophecy that has been told, which the world calls doomsday, but there is something far more important. How do we understand how to be during a physical pole shift and directly afterwards? For the Maya, it is a vibration that comes from within your heart. And this vibration is in perfect resonance to the heart of the earth, the heart of the sun, and the heart of the universe. If we learn to live within this vibration, the living earth will make certain that we extend ourselves into the new world. The secret can only be said in words, but it can only be lived to know the meaning. Words are from the brain, but what we need to remember has nothing to do with the brain. It has to do with the human heart. To use words, and I'll use them, I could say that within the heart is a sacred space where creation takes place, and that living within this sacred space changes one's relationship to all of nature and to the universe. The brain has an ego that sees itself separate from the reality and also sees itself as the most important part of the reality. But within the heart, one is not separate from the reality, but becomes one with the reality. There is no separation, and all parts are equal. The Mayans speak about this constantly, how no human being is greater than any others, that we are all the same. So as you can see, words may describe what we are talking about, but you cannot taste this other way without entering into the sacred space of the heart and feeling and becoming one with this vibration. This is something where we will have to discuss at another time. Perhaps the best way to show you the heart of the Mayan people is to continue with the story. Now we are going to move into the jungles of Guatemala. In June of 2007, I turned over my manuscript for The Serpent of Light over to my publisher, Weiser Publishing. There were many stories of the ceremonies of the Mayan people and other tribes as the interior energies of the earth were altered. In July of 2007, as I said before, Don Alejandro and his wife came to Sedona and asked for a meeting. After Don Alejandro spoke about the pole shift, he also told me that very soon, according to the Mayan calendar at that time, the world was going to enter into the end of time, and certain ceremonies must take place in preparation, and that these ceremonies were marked in the Mayan calendar. This is before the blue sphere ever even appeared. Don Alejandro then began to speak about the Spanish conquistadors and how they had destroyed almost all of the Mayan artifacts and records. And in so doing, the Mayan lost much of their knowledge and their prophecy and their wisdom. But then Don Alejandro spoke of how secret documents were hidden from the conquistadors and that the time had now come to rebuild this knowledge. He then said that according to the Mayan prophecy, the Mayan had to, at this time, begin to reconstruct their knowledge, their experience and wisdom and memories, and that this was the time that this had to be initiated, and that during this time, the world would be watching. Don Alejandro said that the Mayan Council saw this as a group of people coming from all the continents and a vast number of countries around the world, and this group would represent the world. He asked me to find these people, exactly 60 of them, and gather them together in Guatemala City on a specific day in November of that year, 2007. From there, he and the Mayan Council would take them into the jungles of Guatemala to watch the Mayan Council begin to bring their knowledge together again, and also to perform ceremony with this world group. Well, this was easy for me. It took about 60 phone calls, and it was done. They came from 23 countries. In this invited group was Grandfather Eric from the Hopi tribe and 3 elders from the Sierra Nevada, Santa Marta of Colombia, South America. One was a Kogi Mamos, and the other was an Arahuacos Mamos and his brother. These 2 tribes are significant because of the ancient past. Don Alejandro told me that the Maya were originally from Atlantis. I had known this for years, but it was pretty powerful to hear this from his words. And so let's revisit Atlantis for a quick moment to take a look and to see why these other 3 tribes, the Hopi, the Kogi, and the Arahuacos, were so important. Atlantis was a country that was symbolized by 3 rings, one ring inside of the other. The outer ring or sphere, and it could also be seen as 3 spheres. That's another way that Atlantis saw themselves. The outer ring or sphere stood for the people who lived in Atlantis. The middle ring or sphere stood for the priesthood, and they were called Maya. The priesthood were the bridge between the people and the center ring or sphere, who were called the Nacals. It was spelt N-A-K-K-A-L-S and sometimes spelt N-A-C-C-A-L-L-S. The Nacals were the ones who were speaking directly from their sacred space of their hearts and connected directly with the spirit of Mother Earth and beyond. They lived in caves and in special rooms within the pyramids, and they glowed in the dark, and they floated about a few inches off the ground. The Hopi were Maya, and the Maya are Maya, and the Kogi and the Arahuacos Mamos were and are the Nacals, which also include the Wiwas and the Caguamos tribes in Colombia. When Atlantis sank 13,000 years ago, because of the physical pole shift we just mentioned, the Maya jumped into their boats and rowed to the Yucatan, not far from where the southwest area of Atlantis existed. And the Nacals rode in their boats to where Santa Marta, Colombia is now, or at least not far from there. All these tribes are all related, and all of these tribes remember what happened. Not only 13,000 years ago, all these tribes remember 26,000 years ago, and even much longer. But this would be the first time since Atlantis sank that all three of these tribes would be together and perform ceremony. It was historical. Even further, according to Grandfather Eric, he was the first Hopi to ever return to Guatemala since they left Guatemala thousands of years ago to head north to the Four Corners area, which we talked about before. The Mayan Council of Elders began by leading us to Lake Atitlan, one of the most sacred lakes of the Mayan people. Our group was met by 25 members of the 440 elders who had been elected to be the ones to begin the remembering of their knowledge. There are other ways the Mayan remember their knowledge besides using their brains, through the use of the 13 crystal skulls, one for each 1,000 years since Atlantis. In a little bit, we'll talk about this in a little bit. It's an extraordinary subject. The world group sat down in a half circle around the 25 Mayan elders as they began with the Mayan glyph for the number 0. They literally began to decipher this glyph as if they had never seen it before. After about an hour and a half, the Mayans had completed the number 0. And then they went to the glyph for the number 1. We watched them as they went, I think, through 1, 0, and 2, I think, and we got that much in. We spent about a half a day witnessing this event. And then our part was over. The world watched as the Mayans began to recreate their knowledge, and the prophecy was fulfilled. The next morning, the Mayan Council of Elders took us by boat to the far side of Lake Atitlan, to a place where only Mayan ceremony is performed. This was to be a Mayan fire ceremony. The boat ride over these waters, was something that every person there will probably remember for the rest of their life. This towering volcano over this lake, perching on the edge of this lake, left one with this ominous feeling that it would explode at any moment. I mean, it had smoke coming out of it. And no wonder the Mayan did the fire ceremony there. On a remote beach, with the sound of the waves lapping endlessly and the deep blue sky forming the heavens above us, Don Alejandro shaped our diverse group into a circle. And in near silence, after an hour-long preparation with each stage of the fire ceremony carefully and geometrically created, this beautiful arrangement of rocks and herbs and candles and other sacred objects was ready for the fire to give life to the ceremony. This was very unusual. I don't know if the fire ceremony had ever been photographed before, and especially in the way that they did this. They actually let us see as they made the geometrical images on the ground, and they explained what each thing was. As they put in each herb, they told us what it meant. As they laid each candle and each object in there, they described exactly what this meant. This may have never been done before, and according to Don Alejandro, this ceremony had not taken place for 13,000 years. The Hopi, the Kogi Mamos, and the Awakos Mamos, and the members of the Mayan Councils of Elders, and Don Alejandro, and our humble group from all over the world, lowered our heads in prayer as the first flames began to reach to the open sky. Though we were from all over the world and from many different traditions and cultures, we all entered into our hearts and emerged in prayer with one voice and one heart. We prayed for Mother Earth and for her children, knowing that the earth was about to enter into a very violent stage of evolution, much like childbirth. Each one of us prayed from our hearts for Mother Earth to help all of the world and all life on earth. This ceremony was about 3 hours long, and about 1 hour into it, as I was watching the flames of the fire and listening to the prayers, the Awakos man, he was actually had his eyes closed. His arm went up to the sky like this. It caused all of us to look up. We didn't know what he was doing. And there was exactly where he was pointing to in the sky was a huge eagle just floating over the ceremony, about 100 feet perhaps in the air. It was not moving a single feather and seemed to be fixed in space without moving its wings. It sat there for over 10 minutes, and then the eagle floated off to the side a little ways, a few feet, and continued to watch as we performed a ceremony that had not been performed for a very, very, very long time. The prayers, the songs, the chanting, the dancing, the fire, the smoke, all rising to heaven, where hopefully the intentions would be listened to by our mother and our father. Our hearts were wide open. It was incredible, this whole experience. As we climbed into the boats to return to the other side of the lake, I watched. I will probably never forget this. I stood there as all these people got onto the boat, and I watched our uncommon group as they walked down the pier. Religions from the Christianity, Muslim, Jewish, Buddhist, Taoist, Shinto, Hindu, and many more. And all mixed in were between were the ancient tribes from Atlantis and the land of Lotus. Don Alejandro and the Mayan elders were looking for something. I knew this in my heart. And whatever it was, they must have found it during this ceremony. For they asked us to do another ceremony in a place a long ways away from Lake Atitlan, a place called Tikal, an ancient temple site in Guatemala that represented the crown chakra in the human body, the entryway into higher consciousness. Tikal is a majestic world of temples that once had a city around these primary temples that extended for tens of miles in all directions. It was a huge city that probably housed millions of Maya at one point. I remember looking at an artist description of this city and how it probably looked when it was alive. It looked like a city of the far distant future and space age, not from the past and a people that modern people think is just a modern tribe. I mean, a primitive tribe. The Mayans say that before Atlantis, they came from the stars. And if you were to look at what had been discovered in Tikal in the early 1980s, and you saw this all, you just might begin to believe. We followed Don Alejandro and the Mayan elders up to a high place where ceremony had obviously been performed countless times before. And again, they slowly and tediously began to recreate the structure of the Mayan fire ceremony. This, as before, took over an hour just to construct before even the fire was lit. At first, it seemed to be a repeat of the first ceremony, only slowly the atmosphere began to change. Every time Don Alejandro would raise his arms up to the enormous trees that we were cradled in, the wind would blow through them and around us. It was pretty dramatic. That after about 10 times or so, we began to expect it. He'd put his arms up and we'd just wait for the wind to blow. Then the light began to change. And these beams of light began to cut through the branches and the trees, making it feel like we were in an ancient cathedral in perhaps southern France or somewhere. Tourists began to watch and found that they couldn't leave. It was so mesmerizing. There was a beauty in this ceremony. But I felt that Don Alejandro and the elders were still watching and waiting for something again. I couldn't help it. I felt in my heart, but I couldn't say what it was. I felt that they were looking for signs, like the eagle we talked about before, that could only come from Pachamama, or Mother Earth. No human being could make up these or influence the outcome. It had to come from Mother Earth. Whatever they were, whatever these signs were, they must have appeared, for we were asked to continue. The Mayan elders took us to another temple and remote Mayan temples, one that I had never heard of before. I'd never even seen this before. But once I had seen them and several of these temples, I couldn't understand, why the world hadn't known about them. They were exquisite and held such a deep power within the earth. But we didn't do anything in these ceremonies. We didn't do any ceremony in these other places. Don Alejandro only wanted us to experience them, or perhaps for the energies of these temples to experience us. Perhaps now is the time to talk about the other way the Maya return their knowledge, experience, and wisdom and memories to the present day from a distant past time that almost seems to be lost forever. They do this not with their brains, but with their hearts, something that the ancient world are experts at, just as we are experts with our brain. What I'm about to tell you did not come from Don Alejandro, but from Humbotzman and the Mexican Yucatan, and my experiences in that land. It is an information that has been held secret until just recently. I can talk about this, but I have to be a little careful in what I say. It was the Mayan grandmother societies that created the crystal skull pathway of knowledge. Much like we do with our computers that contain memory for whatever we want to remember at a later date, so do the crystal skulls. And just as our computers are based on silicon to accomplish this ability to have memory, so are the crystals made of silicon to also contain memory. The first crystal skull came from Atlantis, but the second came from the new Mayan world after the Earth shifted and her physical pole shifted 13,000 years ago. Each crystal skull was created every 1,000 years and contained the memories of the last 1,000 years. Altogether, there are 13 crystal skulls containing the memories of the last 13,000 years. When it was time, every 1,000 years, a Mayan grandmother was chosen, and she would prepare for her destiny. She would begin by having a crystal skull carved into a human skull. It was usually a male shaman who would select the crystal and actually make the actual carving of this human skull. Different types of crystals were used depending upon the time and the need. It could take many years for this crystal skull to be made ready for the final ceremony, which the whole tribe prepared for ceremony for actually 1,000 years. Then the grandmother would select a young man or a woman, and one time she selected both together, a man and a woman. To be selected for the crystal skull ceremony was a great honor and a privilege for this young Mayan person or couple. Once the grandmother selected the right person, this person went into a training from the time, usually from when they were a baby, all the way till when they were much, much older, which was then completed when the crystal skull ceremony began. This honored person would study to know as much as possible about everything that the Mayan nation knew at that time. In other words, really over the last 1,000 years. They would also embody the Mayan wisdom, sacred arts of higher knowledge, everything they knew, their memories, everything. They would try to put this all into one person. And this person, in doing this and in learning this, would almost inevitably become a shaman in this training. When the Mayan elders felt that this person was ready and in conjunction with the Mayan calendar, they would, along with the grandmother, prepare for the sacred crystal ceremony, crystal skull ceremony. The destiny of both this person and the grandmother were about to be sealed for thousands of years. In the Mayan crystal skull ceremony that was held every 1,000 years, the chosen person and the grandmother would then ingest a very special concoction made of natural herbs, psychedelic plants, and mushrooms. It was made very strong. And the reason was because that this person that was selected and the grandmother would eat this concoction during the ceremony, and this would lead them into a very special experience within their hearts that would soon separate them from their bodies, but not from the earth. In other words, they would die, but they wouldn't go on into the other levels. And with the whole tribe surrounding them in prayer and encouragement, their spirits would leave their bodies and enter into the physical crystal skull. And both of them, the specially selected person and the grandmother, would then take this crystal skull to be their physical body for the next thousands of years until the time that we are now in now, the end of time. Sometime during the end of time, the Maya will perform this final Mayan crystal skull ceremony. I actually just got an email from Humbotzman 4 days before I arrived here, and I now know that that it has not taken place yet, but they will be doing this very soon. This is an amazing ceremony. 13 Mayan shamans which could be men or women, will receive the spirits of these ancient Mayan souls into their modern day Mayan bodies, and then remember everything that these spirits remembered, the ancient ones. It's even better than a computer, for it remembers the emotional aspects as well. When this ceremony takes place, the Maya that are living today remember all of the past to the time of Atlantis and even before. And then the Maya will then combine this knowledge and memories with the intellectual process of the 25 Mayan elders that are rewriting Mayan history, and the Mayan nation will then become whole again. They will remember everything, both from their brains and from their hearts. That's their plan, and I think that they will achieve this. And as for us, the rest of the world, a great blessing will occur, for now the Mayan nation is intact, both with the ancient and modern knowledge, and experience, and wisdom and memories at the same time. It's all part of the Mayan prophecy, and you are alive to know the truth of this prophecy. At one point, Don Alejandro simply raised his arms and said, "Okay, now we're going to go to the heart of the Maya land," whatever that meant. I didn't know. We began to travel, but to where, I didn't have any idea. We had this big modern silver bus, and it was sliding down the freeways and highways and moving through beautiful jungles of the Guatemala. We didn't know where it was going. We drove for hours and hours to this unknown location, and then I just fell asleep. I remembered the rhythm of the wheels slapping on the pavement. That was it. I just began to dream. The next thing I know, suddenly, without any notice, Don Alejandro orders the bus off to the side of the road. I wake up and I look outside, and it was anywhere. It could have been anywhere at all. It was just, it was a landscape that could have been really anywhere in Guatemala. Fields of grass on both sides, fenced in by old rusty barbed-wired fences. Totally everyday, nothing exciting, no temples, no nothing. We all got out of the bus, kind of meandering around like a bunch of ants, not knowing what to do or where to go. And then finally, Don Alejandro and the elders walked over to the other side of the road where there was a break in the fencing. It was just, it was like a corridor. There were fences that came in and then went this way, and there was a little space in the middle. If you would have drove by it, you wouldn't even have seen it. And we followed the Maya into this narrow, grassy pathway, and having no idea what was, inside of here. We walked for a long ways, about a mile or so, and it became more rocky. And it was clear that we were approaching some kind of low mountains. And the trees began to surround us and became dense. Then the elders sharply turned to the left and entered into another fence field that quickly began to emerge as, really true jungle, and a jungle that obviously somebody had been taking care of. It was just too beautiful. Brightly colored birds flew back and forth. Stepping stones appeared just when you needed them. Everything became moist and green and manicured. It was more hotel-like than something that nature would come up with. But here it was, in the middle of nowhere. Then, surprisingly enough, but not really surprising, there was a beautiful wooden building blocking the entire valley floor that we were moving through. It was a structure built by the Mayans long ago to protect something that we were about to be allowed to enter into. The caves where the Mayan emerged out into this world long before Atlantis. To the Native Americans, it is called the Sipapu, and the Holy of Holies to them. I felt myself become very quiet inside. People were talking and realizing that food was about to be given to us, but the intrigue of what lay on the other side of this open-air restaurant was almost unbearable. The elders sat us down in this beautiful structure with the tropical jungle that was just coming in from all sides, and they gave us a traditional Mayan meal. We had a long journey ahead of us, but we didn't know that. But the elders did. They were just taking care of us. After our lunch, in single file, We began to move into the region behind this building, that slowly sloped upwards as we approached the mountain that was now in front of us. I became even more still inside, and I began to chant within myself as I walked closer and closer to something that I just really didn't understand. And then it happened. A small hole in the side of the mountain appeared, not much bigger than for maybe 2, maybe 3 people at the most to enter in at the same time. It took a while, but eventually all of us were inside the mountain in a long, narrow tunnel. We were now completely inside of Mother Earth. Somewhere in this tunnel, Don Alejandro corralled us all together and talked to us to explain a little bit about this cave. This was a very sacred cave for the Mayan nation. He told us that the cave continued for 28 kilometers, but that we were only going to go in for a few kilometers, and for us to be very careful as it would be getting wet and slippery inside. And this was obvious because it was already getting wet. We continued for just a little bit further, and there before us lay something that I didn't expect at all. The narrow tunnel came to an end in a T, and in front of us was another opening that was huge. I mean, it was twice as big as a football field and perhaps 75, maybe 90 feet high. And a piece of the ceiling had fallen in a long time ago, and a beam of light came shooting into the darkness and flooded this enormous cave with this angelic light that made you stop and open your heart. You couldn't help it. It was just instinctive. And then we all climbed down from this narrow cave, down an old ladder to the floor of this new cave, and turned to the left. We really kind of had no choice, and continued as a small creek weaved itself from one side of the cave to the other. We were constantly having to walk through this pure, crisp, pristine water. Most of the time, as we left this shaft of light, we had to use our flashlights to keep from falling into some hidden rocks or cliffs or somewhere. And it was very dark, and most of us just kept talking simply because we wanted to make sure somebody was there. If you turned off your light, it was completely black. You couldn't see your hand in front of your face. After a very long and somewhat dangerous journey into Mother Earth, we again came across another place where the ceiling had fallen out of the earth, and it exposed another beam of sunlight to the interior of the cave. It wasn't much, but it was nevertheless, it made it possible for us that we could see. Don Alejandro stopped us, and he said that another ceremony had to be performed here in this place. It was another fire ceremony, but it was completely different than the first 2 that we had done at Lake Tatalan and Tikal. The fire was in circles. It was the most beautiful